Hello, welcome to the Sideboard here at the StarCityGames.com Season 1 Invitational in Richmond. I am Nick Miller alongside Mr. Brewmaster himself, AJ Kerrigan. How you doing?
Pretty good. How about yourself?
It's good. It's a good handshake right there. We'll ignore all that. You've got yourself a green-red deck. You've been playing with Anthony Lowry, another one of your friends. And you got a ton of new Dragons of Tarkir cards in here. So what brought you to the red-greenish, green-reddish Aggro variant?
So last format, green-red was not a very good deck, I think. It struggled against the whip decks. It didn't even have a great Abzan matchup. And overall, the deck was kind of mediocre. When looking at the new format and deciding what seems good, I started to look at, well, what were the problems a lot of the decks from the previous format had? And I saw the biggest thing I felt with green-red was that it didn't really have a cohesive game plan, and I had to play a lot of cards that I consider bad, like Fanatic of Xenagos, and those cards just can't punch through the whip decks or the Abzan decks. But what the Dragons of Tarkir gave us is it gave us a lot of death touch creatures and a lot of flyers and a lot of really good removal spells for the ground creatures. So I started out, well, how can we integrate these new cards in the deck to make it where we want it? And from there, it just kind of took off. I tested it a bunch, and I was beating a lot of the matchups that I thought would be really prevalent here. And I just went and tuned it from there. We'll
go over some of the cards here, but explain to me how you came up with the game plan. You said, you had to have this solid game plan you wanted, and how the cards tie into that. So you've got your mana dudes, you got your Elvish Mystics, Radical Mystics, and then you start going in your creatures. You got a bunch of death touch creatures between Heir of the Wilds and the new all-star, Death Mist Raptor. Look at that Raptor. That guy's sweet. He's probably my favorite art of the new set. Along with the card, one of the few cards of the tournament already that's popping up is Thunderbreak Regent, the new dragon, of course. Then you have your all-stars, Stormbreath Dragon, Ashcloud Phoenix as well.
Yeah. So starting with the Mandadorks, like I said, we just want to be playing creatures that get over their creatures or get through their creatures. And the Mandadorks help you get into those really quickly because you can beat Siege Rhino with flyers, but if you're playing flyers on the same turn they're playing Siege Rhino, they're probably just going to be able to race you because you guys have the same power. So the point of the Mandadorks is to easily get out ahead of them, and then you have a lot of ways to sink your mana in the late game, so they're not really that bad. Then the Death Touch creatures, Heir of the Wilds and Death Mist Raptor, those are your creatures with flying that don't have flying. They get through all of the relevant blockers in the early game. Heir of the Wilds quickly becomes a 3-power attacker in this deck because you have so many 4 guys on turn 3 and turn 4. And then Death Mist Raptor is just insane. So I originally didn't have him in the deck because I was skeptical, just a 3-mana 3/3, what are we doing? But once I found I wanted more evasive creatures or pseudo-evasive creatures, I looked to Death Mist Raptor, and I found that his ability of returning to play is much more relevant than I originally thought. So you have Rattleclaw Mystic as another way to get him back, which makes your Rattleclaw Mystics better too because they do something in the late game where they normally might not. And then he can be a 4/4, which means he can turn on Ferocious for a lot of your different Ferocious cards, and he attacks through more creatures in the late game. And he's really good with himself because one gets back the other ones. And he just doesn't get blocked by Courser of Krufix. He trades up all the time. He's a really good blocker in the matchups where you need to be blocking. Overall, just an amazing card, and I think he's going to be one of the better cards from the set.
Yeah, that's interesting. You see all these decks that have all of the mana creatures, but then you end up with creatures that don't do anything in the late game. Having the Radical Mystic be able to just morph in the late game to get back to your death, the Raptor, seems very powerful. Not to mention your Ashcloud Phoenix can also morph at some point to get back your Raptor, so that's pretty sweet. You've got the new removal spell du jour from Dragons of Tarkir, Roast, killing all your Siege Rhinos and such.
Yeah, Roast. I originally had the new card Draconic Roar, but what we found is, like I said, people can race you with Siege Rhinos. That card is quite the clock. You really need Roast to get rid of the cards like Goblin Rabblemaster, Siege Rhino, Courser of Krufix, the things that aren't necessarily roadblocks in your way because you have a lot of ways to attack through them, but are cards that can kill you or generate a major advantage before you can really get ahead. So Roast is 2 mana and kills almost everything we want to kill in this deck. There's a couple flyers that can be kind of annoying, but that's where hopefully the rest of your removal spells come into play, or the fact that your flyers are just bigger than theirs.
Right. You've got Wild Slash, which is basically the best tempo play alongside Chain of the Rocks, in the format. You got 3 of that. Then you got 4 Crater's Claws, though you don't have the Devotion Shell. As you were telling me, you have so much mana in the late game, you have a ton of things to do with it, so Crater's Claw turns into be a pretty big threat.
Yeah, it's basically a split card in this deck because early in the game it can kill creatures, especially like the turn when you have a bunch of Mandadorks, you play like a dragon and kill like their Goblin Rabblemaster in the same turn. That helps a lot as far as tempo. And then Wild Slash is mostly a concession to other Wild Slashes because the decks with all the X2s like Goblin Rabblемasters and Heir of the Wilds, if they play a Wild Slash against you killing your Mandadork, they gain so much tempo, and their decks are quicker than yours, so you really need a way to keep up with them, and Wild Slash I found is the best way to do that, and it goes to the face in a pinch, right? And then Kratos Claws just kills them in the late game, does
Right.
6 to 8 damage when sometimes you hit them with dragons, because your dragons, a lot of them have haste, but you just can't get through those last points.
And as you mentioned, most of your creatures can get up to the 4 power. You got your Stormbolt Dragon, your Thunderbreak Regent, Ash Cloud, even Deathmist Raptor. When you flip it,
Yeah.
it becomes a 4 power creature thanks to the new Megamorph.
Yeah, like I said, the point of this deck is just to go over their creatures or go through their creatures, and we're playing 11 flyers that all have 4 power. I found that's the best way to just go through what people are doing. You can play new cards like Sirach or like Boon Satyr, but those cards just are very quickly bricked in the middle of the game, and they do other things, but I want my cards to all be individually powerful
Right.
and not require other threats to make them good. So that's what we tried to go for this deck, is all the creatures are going to deal damage by themselves at some point.
Card that's been sneaking up, a lot of people have in their sideboards and their main decks. Haven of the Spirit Dragon here. I like it. In the sideboard, I assume you bring this in like the grindy matchup so you can recur your dragons.
Yeah, so what's it for? We'll get to the other sideboard cards in a second, but you have a lot of Planeswalkers and Corsair of Crucifixes in your sideboard.
Right.
And with those cards, you want extra lands, because once you're raising the curve of your deck, boarding out removal spells, you need more lands to put them into play consistently. The thing is, with 8 mana dorks, you don't really want 24 lands, but 23 is really not enough.
Okay.
So we tried to find somewhere in the middle, and we said, well, what's a good utility land we can play? In the control matchups, our mana base is good enough that we can afford to play a mostly colorless land. And it does cast Thunderbreak Regent and Stormbreath. It does provide the second red. And then it's just really good at getting back the big cards that matter in the matchups, which are the Thunderbreak Regents and the Stormbreaths. Because they're throwing all their removal spells at those creatures, because those are the ones that are going to kill them. And then you just have an extra one once you're drawing too many lands. You have a way to recycle your lands.
So you do a little switcheroo between your mana guys. You bring in the coursers, things like that, so you're not drawing 1/1s late in the game.
Yeah.
You get your card advantage.
Yeah, you get to take out your 1/1s and your removal spells that don't do anything. And it's really
Imagine
important.
the Planeswalker suite here of Nissa, Sarkhan, and Xenagos does the same thing. You want those in the grindy matchups.
Yeah, the mix of them is a concession to the fact that we're not actually sure which ones are good in this format, because different ones can come in, they all come in against control, but different ones can come in different matchups. Like Xenagos is fine against mono red, Nissa and Sarkhan are fine against Abzan. So once the format settles out a little more, we'll probably pick some of the Planeswalkers to hone in on, but threat diversification I find is really important at these larger events with a wide open metagame. So.
Right, so you had Arc Lightning, Barrage Boulders, a lot of ways to kill a lot of cheap creatures, and then some Destructive Revelries. Everyone's playing enchantments of some kind.
Yeah, Chain to the Rocks, Outpost Siege, Corsair of Crucifix, Mastery of the Unseen. In a lot of those matchups, it's your most efficient way to kill them. A lot of people I saw are playing Reclamation Sage in their sideboard, but the 2/1 body doesn't actually do anything in those matchups, because in the matchups you're boarding it in, they already have a bunch of creatures in play by the time Reclamation Sage could really get in more than 2 damage. So Destructive Revelry is a very consistent 2 damage to the face, and it's a lot cheaper than the other options.
Right. So in your testing, when you're coming up with this kind of deck, what did you expect the metagame to be? Obviously it's going to be wide open, it's week 1. Were there decks you're honing in on that you just kind of knew were going to be, or other than like Abzan and Jeskai, what were you really thinking?
We were focusing mostly on Mono Red and Abzan. I thought those would be 2 of the most popular decks, and then I thought there would be a healthy amount of control, like blue, black, blue, white. People want to play with Narset. People want to play with all the new draw spells like Anticipate. And then, that was mostly what we were trying to focus on, because I figured there's obviously going to be other decks, but they're not going to be enforced. Like I expect the mirror match a little bit. I expect red, white, aggro. So what we were looking at is the control matchup. Our deck's just very good. We have a lot of haste creatures, a lot of recursive creatures. Deathmist Raptor does a lot of work. And even our mana dorks, because of the 4 Kratos Claws, do a lot in the late game, because the 1 and 2 damage they get in at a time does mean a lot to them. So they're like waiting till turn 5 to play their Wrath, and you have a lot of ways to get damage too. And against mono red, you just have a lot of removal spells, and your creatures are bigger than theirs, so you block for a little bit, and then you attack. And
If you had to pick one Dragons or Tarkir card to break out this weekend, what would it be?
I think it's going to be Deathmist Raptor. I think the Devotion decks are playing that, and the Aggro decks are playing that, and the mid-range decks are playing it. And the card is very good. It can fill multiple roles. It can block, it can attack, and it can eat removal spells really well. And it grows with the game, which is also something that's really important too.
Well, you're ahead of the curve as usual. AJ, thanks for sitting down with me here in the sideboard. Stay tuned to StarCityGames.com all weekend long for the action here at the Invitational.